Hi, and welcome back to Unplanned. Today we're talking with Leonardi Aray, and we're going to talk about cities in the Americas. I think is that
correct? That's what we're going to be talking about.
And help us understand what that topic is. What's that all about?
So, as you know, I'm originally from Venezuela. I've been here for almost a quarter of a century.
Right.
I haven't realized that long. And I studied architecture back home, and then I got my master's in community planning here in Rhode Island. And that there was a really interesting path for me to learn more or learn about American cities and the history of American cities. And as I've been working on the field, there's a lot of frustration why our cities are this way or not the other way. And there's a lot of reference of Europe and why our cities can operate like Europe and why our walking streets don't look like Europe and all that. And I think we need to embrace what our American cities are. And it's just not like the American cities in the United States, but it's also like in South America, how new of these cities these are. And we probably have a lot of commonalities between the United States cities and maybe some of the cities in the Caribbean and South America that we can understand why, as great as they are, why certain changes have not happened the way we want it. And it might be the form of government, it might be the ownership of the land, and how new they were just only 400, 300 years ago compared to many of the American cities, of the European cities, right? And so that's kind of where.
That was part of when we were talking earlier about this conversation. We were talking about that fact that Europeans arrived on the shores all from Canada all the way down to the tip of Chile, and then they created all these cities. But it was really in the wilderness, as they say, and that is actually a really fascinating topic.
It is.
So what do you take away from your experiences of seeing cities across the Americas, and what are some of your further thoughts on some of this stuff?
So, one of the things is certainly the dominance of the automobile, right? Even though, like here in Cambridge, New England, we may have some frustration on how much space we have given to it. We embrace that. That was the idea. We have the space. Cities have the space. From Caracas to through here. They have land outside. Building a highway was kind of the model. And certainly has ease, commerce, and access to many places. So we have that ingrained there, very different than other places because there was nothing built. And we gave a lot of space for the vehicles. So I think we can look at how other cities within the continent have dealt with the use of car or managing the use of the vehicle within their cities. And I think we will start to see things differently. We're probably going to have a more constructive exchange of how to improve that relationship with the automobile than looking into cities that probably were not as aggressive because of the way they were built naturally and for many other previous years before the arrival of the automobile.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Although American cities, and by American cities, I don't just mean the United States of America, but cities in the Americas, obviously predate the automobile. And they were not that old when the automobile arrived. Right. And that, of course, is not true in Europe for European cities. It really was a very severe retrofit. What would be some of the cities that might come to mind as you think just about the automobile? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of topics that sort of fit within that, but
survival with it, or that how difficult has been to get rid of the use of the vehicle.
Well, so where you would look for examples of in a sense how we survive with the automobile, how we go forward, looking at examples from across the Americas of different ways of approaching the issue or different ways that problems have been solved or addressed.
Yeah, so I can think, somehow what it comes to mind is Houston, which is a very car-oriented vehicle, no question about it. However, every time that I go, there's more of those models that we keep talking about more pedestrian, green space within city, housing, and all that. So the presence of the automobile and the users of the automobile is there. The infrastructure is being laid out differently from what I can see anecdotally. Garages are very common. Same thing in Caracas, down in Venezuela. Garages are common. You can find garages in many, many places. Here, we don't see a lot of garages. I mean, they are, but you can go blocks and blocks, and there's no centralized garage. And we are very dependent on street parking, which is needed. That's part of the activation of the street as well. So I think that creates a level of frustration and presence of the car, whether in traffic or people driving around in space. The idea of building garages may help to manage the vehicle. I would think that people will think, well, you build more garages, more cars will come. But I think we need to understand that the presence of the vehicle is there.
Yeah. What about, so vehicles, obviously we could talk for a long time about transportation, about vehicles, private travel, public travel, all that kind of stuff. What about other areas that you think of? I know you are very active in housing, the housing space. What observations have you made over the course of time? How cities both differ and are similar, say, across the Americas. That's sort of the broad template that I'm using to think about these issues.
So, the building typology certainly, you can correlate it the use of the vehicle, the type of vehicle people may have, or how many vehicles you have, right? If you live in the city in proximity to amenities, shops, work, and all that, likely, whether or not you have it available, it may not be a priority for people living in a multifamily building, right? So even in Caracas, I grew up in a building that was a 16, 18-story building, and it had a huge underground garage. So people park, right? But we know here people may not be as dependent on the vehicle if they have access to it. If you live in a single family house, even in a duplex and all that, in a driveway, why not to have your vehicle there, right? So I think there's a relationship and the amount of stuff also that we carry on the size of the homes that we have. I think people see that, people say, well, would I like to live in a flat on a tall building? And this is putting aside the cost, right? Because whether it's affordable to live. We have multiple tall condominiums in Boston that are very, very high end, and I'm sure there's parking and everything there. But I think as a housing model, right, depending on the housing model, the use of the vehicle will be totally related, right? So if you have townhomes, for instance, I think it's a very tight model. There's only so much space on the front and the back that if you like the living experience of the townhome on a location that relates to the type of housing, you automatically won't see the need, or you don't see the relationship of a car parked on the front and back or under your house, right? When you look at single family home and now you have distance between lots and between the amenities, I think you automatically think in the image of a vehicle. So I think those typology will drive one or the other.
Yeah. So let's find out a little bit more about you and kind of not only your background but the work you're doing now. So you studied architecture. Then in Rhode Island you studied urban planning, and now my sense is you're doing a lot of housing projects. Is that correct?
Most of our work has been in housing. And my interest in particular affordable housing started when I was doing my master of community planning for my final project. I decided to look at what affordable housing would be in the Caracas core.
Right.
And it was a speculative program, but it was looking at case study of affordable housing here in bringing back, the things that I observed in Caracas when I was studying architecture. So, I've been a licensed architect here for, I think, 15 years now. And so we have a lot of work with multiple housing authority fixing those buildings. We do some residential work very selectively, and we've done some housing planning work. as well.
Right. Just going back to your study, your original study, when you were doing your thesis, what did you find when you were thinking about the affordable housing model as it related to Caracas? What was
it is tough to relate it, right? Because whatever the form of government finances and all this kind of that, I'm not that familiar at this point what's happening there than compared to what is happening here. But I divided it pretty much in three different approaches. One will be through activism. What people can do to say, well, we would like to change whatever action is going to take on a larger space, on a large parcel within the city, where people can advocate for those uses rather than an office building. Maybe why don't we build more housing? I took inspiration on that one from Tent City in Boston, the Back Bay.
Right.
That was land owned with the MBTA and the city, and combination of that, and people really advocated for it. And I believe the name Tent City comes from people tenting outside to protest for building housing rather than other uses, right? Then the other one through regulation, right? So inclusionary zoning is an example, which would be very debated here. I think in an area like Caracas will be, you see the amount of construction, you say, well, if you're going to build an 18-story building, can you allocate a few of those? How you make it work, will be, but that's another approach. In the other approach, there was, a full-blown intervention from the central government to provide funding to the creation of public housing. In those, just rather than one model or having these different scenarios to work it out. Also at that time, I think I don't know how far it went, but in Venezuela they were giving some sort of voucher or something to buy a vehicle, car actually.
Right.
And they were building a lot of the affordable homes outside the city. Right. And my case was why don't we use those funds to actually give to people to purchase a home or rent a home in the city.
Yeah.
And also the one of the things that the most I think what inspired me the most to look into housing, particularly affordable housing, was in Caracas and many other cities in Latin America is the shanty towns that are all around you.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because a topic that I have found fascinating ever since I interacted with urban planning as a study is what we might call informal residential.
Right.
It is completely fascinating.
We call it in Caracas. I am sometimes hear people romanticizing that, like, oh, look, the little street and all that. The question you have to ask, would you raise your kids in there?
Sure.
Would you let your grandmother living up there? And probably the answer is no. Not to say, of course, there's a lot of people that work hard to live in this area, and they become successful. Some of them even have some cousins and things like that. But those are not what we want here, right? So we do not want unsanitary homes. We don't have buildings being dilapidated around our neighborhood. So putting aside the social interest that some people may have and the good feeling of, yes, we want to give the opportunity to everybody to grow up in a safe environment, I think our cities don't want that, right? So we want to create good quality housing, at least for the argument of creating better cities, right? How do we get there and, where your heart is on that? But I'm pretty sure nobody wants to have that in many places in Latin America. You drive on the street, you turn one corner, and you can be in the richest neighborhood, and then there's poverty right in front of you. No infrastructure, none of that. I think we're really far to get to that here.
Right.
But that's what inspired me. I mean, we don't want to go any place near to that. Once you get that, once you have people tenting, and LA has it, right? You have what's the name of the area there in LA? So once you have people living on the street, living on illegal settlements or whatever name you want to give it, there's no way back. There's no way back.
Yeah. How do you process that as a question about cities in the Americas? Because it is an interesting question as to why cities move or develop in some directions and not in other directions. And you mentioned that informal settlement in Latin America, much less so in North America, although North America certainly has had its experience with that, for sure. Yeah. But certainly not in the modern day is that as common as, say, it was back in the 1930s, for example, where there were plenty of those kinds of settlements. How do you understand that as a question of cities in the Americas more broadly? I mean,
so I think that's a long topic, but clearly the resources available in other places in the Americas are not the same than here, and certainly the stability of the government are not the same. The power of the local governments, the capacity to fund initiatives are not the same than what you may have here. The regulations, right? The control over private land. I have no idea how those Shantytown, whether they took over public land in private land. What is definitely true is that once those barriers have grown, you start to accommodate to make it better, which makes sense, right? And there might be some piece of land that the government have to give away to make it better. But I think, and we're very, very careful about that here, right? Any development in town, in the area here, even if it is next door to you, you have a lot of say in what is going to happen, right? So let alone having a group of individuals starting building something little by little. So, I think things, people started looking the other way. And I think that's the fear that's something that we should be careful of, right? That we start looking the other way at an issue that may build up. We have more layers of protection here, right? Particularly the control and the ownership of the land. But there, it happened, continue to happen, and next thing that we're there. I mean, I don't think you can pinpoint one particular item.
Right.
And yes, there's in the case of Venezuela, a lot of the people from the rural areas with no jobs and all that move quickly during the modernization of the cities to places like Caracas for employment. And of course, there was not enough housing there, and people started settling in that.
Right. I mean, there's so many other directions we can go in. What we haven't done yet is compare all of these North American cities to European cities, which, at least in the case of the Americas, certainly on the eastern seaboard of the Americas, all of that original immigration or settlement was from European countries. Right. So we haven't really done a comparison yet of the new world and the old world, if you will. Do you have any quick thoughts on that question? You mentioned the automobile and how that relationship is different. What are some other relationships?
So I've been trying to stay away from that comparison.
Right.
And I traveled to Europe too. I love it there. I lived there when I was a kid. But the comparison, that's when it gets tricky. That's when we start putting ideas in our head in a context that is not the same.
Right.
I don't think, yes, there are things that we can learn, but I'm realizing more and more that could be very superficial.
Right.
So I'm been trying really hard to stay away from it.
Just finally, what is it? I mean, to me, this is a very interesting topic, and like you were saying, I mean, there's so much that can be talked about underneath the umbrella of this topic. But what is it about this topic that you find interesting? This question of cities in the Americas more broadly. I mean,
I think certainly there's the physical form, right? So I think, and I see it in architecture as well, that we need to create better spaces. There's a lot of talk about materials in building performance. I'm a certified passive house consultant. I think it's very important. We should do it that way. But there's a lot of emphasis on that. What I think we're losing is the conversation about creating spaces, quality spaces, how those spaces are defined, and that relationship between the horizontal plane, whether it's the street, the sidewalk, your green, and your vertical elements that are generally the buildings, right? are we really working on creating spaces that are well defined, that they are welcoming? I think we're using a lot of time on the use of the building, the materials of the building, the performance of the building, the style of the building, the height of the building, not, looking at these spaces that we feel this is a nice courtyard, this is a plaza, this is a street section, that in this neighborhood, 2 stories is fine, but the next one, 6, 8 stories, a different experience. So I think if you look around through the Americas, there are very good examples of that, that we get it right. And then now we're starting to trying to place a lot of many, often very important things, and we may start getting away from creating spaces, which ultimately is going to be there. So that's...
Yeah, well, Leonardi Aray, architect, urban planner here in the Cambridge, Somerville area. I would just want to thank you for taking some time to talk to us.
Thank you so much, man. It was amazing. It's always great to see you.
It's great seeing you.